That's one way to think about what's going on historically. Pull back the lens even further, and that's where we get into this reinvention kind of space here. There is a bigger thing going on here. And it's not just about this yin-yang of conservative, progressive, kind of who's controlling the politics, although it's part of that. There's a bigger thing that's going on here, is that the country has gone through, I would argue, 4 fundamental reinventions. Fundamental reinventions, which has essentially been an explosion of innovation that's lasted about 10, 20 years, where we essentially reinvented what it was to be America, how the economy worked, how society worked, how a government worked. And we saw this about 4 times, and I'm arguing we're in our 5th. We're just about to enter the 5th. Now, how does this thing work? If you look at it in the past, 2 fundamental things have always prefaced these explosions of reinvention. One is you get such deep structural changes to the fabric of the economy, like you go from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, that kind of level of structural change going on, or you go from rural living to urban living. I mean, we're talking deep structural change in the country, other countries, to the point that the systems of that old thing that worked in the agricultural or rural living just don't work in this new environment. You have to reinvent on a fundamental level. That's one thing that always shows up. The second thing is the country faces unprecedented challenges, something that the other systems of the old past, they didn't know how to deal with, like nuclear war was the last one we really dealt with. We're like, oh my God. It was just something so out of our world view, you had to really go back to the drawing board of doing it. Every era has had its version of that. Now that 2 double bursts have essentially created these 4 periods of innovation. There was one around the election of 1800, with Thomas Jefferson, was called the Revolution of 1800. We don't kind of remember history that far back, but it was an incredible shift in power. It was much more democratized government and much more decentralized government and much more kind of decentralized economy. It was essentially a period of much more democratized period of America that lasted about 10, 20 years of reinvention, and it lasted the basically the Civil War. There was another reinvention at the Civil War, and we think, okay, Abraham Lincoln, get it, he ended slavery. Go back to history books, tons of other stuff. They essentially opened up the whole country with the Transcontinental Railroad. They opened up the West with the Homestead Act. They basically started land-grant universities to democratize education, higher education. Tons of things happened, an explosion in about 10 or 12 years. Crazy amount of innovation that went. They essentially invented the system and lasted for 50 years. The other one was essentially around 1900. You saw the beginning of the progressive era, Teddy Roosevelt, and then it ended with Woodrow Wilson. Crazy level of experimentation. I'm going to go into that a little bit more here, just a little more detail. And essentially, the last one we saw of this scale was FDR and what came out of the Great Depression, World War II. And essentially, the building of the post-war world. And that world we're still living in here, folks. And it's those systems that are breaking down fundamentally, and that's what needs the reinvention today. This level of history is not Reagan level of history. This is Mount Rushmore. These 3 are Mount Rushmore. And the only reason FDR isn't on Mount Rushmore is because it was built in the 30s, basically, when he was still around. So, but this is the level we're talking about. And this is the level, I would say, and I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but, start to think, I mean, it seems crazy, but I'm saying if he lives up to it, he might not. And again, I don't want to get too into it here, but I'm saying think on that level. That's the level of reinvention. Is that the beginning of an era that actually has that scale? Maybe he's not the guy. Maybe it'll be the next time it'll come. Maybe who knows? Maybe there's a Romney thing. But in my opinion, it has to be something really fundamental. I would argue this is it. Now, to understand this a little bit more, the fabric of how this works, I want to go to the last time we were at this level of transformation. And that was essentially in 1900. Think about the early part of the 20th century. You had essentially industrialization of the country from an agricultural economy. You had this massive influx of people into the cities. The cities were overwhelmed. They didn't have sanitation. They didn't have all kinds of stuff. It was just craziness in the cities. You had incredible problems going on there. In fact, if you go back to their challenges here, in fact, I kind of just mentioned that, you had a very similar thing. You had this 1% crew. This was controlling the economy. It was all kind of out of whack. There was this whole sense, again, of these cities couldn't organize themselves, couldn't keep basic health care going, basic kind of organization going, and it was completely corrupted government. So when we kind of compare ourselves now, we think, oh God, we got problems. I mean, there was a kind of a similar feeling back then. But what happened, really interestingly enough, and this is that one period I just mentioned, the period that started with Teddy Roosevelt, but this is the class of what they literally call it the progressive era, and that was started with a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, ended with Woodrow Wilson. And in the space of about 15 to 20 years, it was an incredible explosion of innovation. I'll just mention a few of them. I mean, they completely took on the robber barons, busted into pieces, Standard Oil, all that kind of stuff just went boom. They basically, for the first time, put in an income tax, which had never been in there. They basically built all these food and safety things, all the meat packing stuff. I mean, get children out of, the factories, all that kind of stuff. Gave women the right to vote. I mean, hey, it hadn't been able to vote. And ultimately, they did this whole thing on environment, too, at the beginning of the national parks and all this. Again, the reason I'm kind of saying this is you can go from these incredibly overwhelming periods of kind of just, oh my God, how are we ever going to solve this, to a burst of innovation that essentially set up things that we're still living with today.